Distinguished moderator and speakers, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and also good morning to some of you. My name is Sharifa Raisi and I'm Deputy Director of the Conference Department at Trans Research and Advisory. On behalf of Dr. Muhammad Abdullah Al-Ali, CEO and founder of Trans Research and Advisory, I am delighted to welcome you all to the Trans Second Annual Political Islam e-Forum, entitled Expansion Project of the Brotherhood, Extent of Decline and Prospects. Through this e-Forum, Trans aspires to be a sponsor of a constructive academic and scholarly dialogue between the Arab and Western worlds of the phenomenon of political Islam. This afternoon, we will be hosting the first e-symposium of this new series, which is entitled The Muslim Brotherhood Between Expansion and Decline, Future Outlook. Trans is committed to advancing the values of the peace and harmony by analyzing all forms of ideologies of extremist nature, whether in Arab world or wider world. It seeks to determine academic and scholarly knowledge in this field, so as to raise awareness of the threats and risks that such ideologies may pose to all societies. To achieve this goal, Trans publishes academic studies of all kinds and organization events in all its forms to contribute to the academic scholarship on the Muslim Brotherhood trajectory and impacts. We hope that this e-symposium will represent another step in this path. I would like to conclude with the following words by Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali, Trans CEO and founder. We as organization have become a reference on matters of political Islam. Dear participants in this first e-symposium of Trans Second Annual Political Islam e-Forum, your presence with us today enhances the position. I welcome you all and we look forward to your presentations and the discussion. Thank you very much for your academic contribution and participation. Dear Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sharifa, and thank you so much for inviting me back to moderate another one of these panels. I think this is a really important time to be having this discussion. It's about 10 years since the Arab Spring begun, and in a way that the Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood, it reached its apex and begun its decline. But even just within the last week, we've been reminded of the importance of looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to understand its effects on the world. Just a few days ago, a man was killed at the Western Wall in Israel, and images have emerged of his killer posing in front of a poster of Muhammad Morsi and of making a Muslim Brotherhood associated sign. And so we can't ignore the threat of extremism posed by the Brotherhood. But as you said, it's between expansion and decline, and I think a lot of this is related to the changing tides in the Middle East, but the continuing hold and in fact growing hold it appears to have on Europe, and that's what we're going to be looking at today. We have a series of excellent speakers. First up, we've got Dr. Ziad Munson. He's a professor of sociology from Lehigh University in the US. And he's going to be discussing the ideological foundation of the Brotherhood's expansion. Second, in Arabic, we have Professor Nasser Aref, who's a professor of political science at Cairo University in Egypt. And I will remind participants then to make sure they turn on the Arabic interpretation on Zoom. Following them, we have Dr. Lorenzo Vedino. He's the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University in the US as well. And he's going to be discussing the Brotherhood's expansion project and its opposition to the prevailing ideas of the nation state. And finally, Dr. Patrice Brodeur. He's a professor at the Institute of Religious Studies in Canada's University of Montreal. And he's going to be discussing the prospects for the Brotherhood's expansion strategy after June 30th, 2013. And then we'll hopefully have time to have a bit of a discussion afterwards, where we'll take a deeper dive into what the speakers spoke about and things of that nature. So rather than wasting any more time in discussion and in introductions, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ziad Munson for the first presentation today. Dr. Munson, please take over.
Great. Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Aisha, Sumaya, and Sharifa, and everyone else who has invited me and worked to put together this e-forum. I'm most excited to hear what some of the other panelists can teach me more than what I might be able to share, and also recognize that time is limited, and speaking first means that my most important job is to stay within my time limit to set a good example for everyone else. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. All of us, I think, are most interested in how rapidly the Muslim Brotherhood situation in Egypt has changed over the last decade, really, as Chris had mentioned. There are now many good accounts and analyses of this period overall, and they're done by people who have more expertise in this period than I do. So I'm not going to really cover that in my talk, and I'm not really going to talk much about groups outside of Egypt beyond the expatriate communities that have greatly expanded since the repression of 2013. Instead, what I want to focus on are some kind of general tools that we all can use to analyze the Muslim Brotherhood. And in particular, I want to focus on the analytic power of social movement theory in general for this purpose. Now, this call's hardly new. I made it in print over 20 years ago. Many others have as well. But I think it's still important because even decades later, there still really is a disconnect between different scholarly communities. On the one hand, area specialists, Brotherhood historians, and Egyptian experts have really only sparingly made use of the tools of social movement studies that have been developed in sociology and political science. And when they have used those tools, they tend to use work that is, to be frank, a decade or even more out of date. Now, on the other hand, social movement scholars, with really only a few notable exceptions, have continued to largely ignore the Muslim Brotherhood or treat it with kind of neo-Orientalist assumptions as if it's incommensurate with other social movement organizations in other places and so forth. So I want to sort of offer a structured starting point for thinking about the ideological dynamics of the Muslim Brotherhood that I hope can bridge these different scholarly communities. And in particular, let me offer three key ways the organization's ideology continues to shape but not determine the group's history, including its modern history, right? In the last decade, in the last few months, and even in the last few weeks. And these three key dimensions are ideology, number one, as a means for framing political claims; ideology, number two, as an element for collective identity; and number three, ideology as a mode of social organization. And so really what I'm going to spend my time, the few minutes that I have here today, talking about those three things. So first of all, let me go to that first dimension. Let me start with the first dimension of its ideological impact, the role of ideology in political claims making. This is often where ideology operates at its most instrumental, and there is 30 years or more of work on social movement framing, frame alignment processes, framing topologies, and other related concepts to help understand the ideological basis of the Muslim Brotherhood's mobilization. Now, Brotherhood scholars have only scratched the surface of this theorizing and research so far. Going through it now is outside the scope of the time that I have. But let me give just one very practical way in which I think this approach to political claims making can be useful. I continue to be surprised how much ink and other chatter among experts is devoted to the relationship of the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology to violence. There are many who see the group's violent tendencies everywhere. And on the other hand, there's a camp that is steadfast in their insistence that violence is not inherent in the group's ideological orientation. Now, my own view is that this is not a very fruitful debate, in no small part because it sets up a false dichotomy. It also reflects an overly unitary and homogenous imagining of the composition of the Muslim Brotherhood, even if we're focused just on the Brotherhood in Egypt. It ignores its long history, extensive reach, and the varied types of members and supporters that it has attracted over its history. But beyond these more obvious points, what a focus on the framing of political claims can help us see is a distinction between ideological tenets of the group that are oriented toward ultimate ends as compared to those tenets oriented towards the means to those ends. The question of violence approached in this way is more usefully couched in terms of how ideology relates to strategy and tactics. It suggests that violence is related to ideology, but need not be conceptualized as endemic or a necessary part of it. Witness how quickly the conservative movement in the United States has moved toward openly justifying calls to political violence in just the last several years, as just one example of the loosely coupled relationship between ideological tenets on the one hand and violence on the other. Now, this sort of basic distinction would be the beginning of a new direction for analysis, not the end, of course. The point is that analytic strategies that allow us to decompose ideology, look at its different components, look at its change over time and so forth, can be really useful for moving beyond false and, to my view, quite tired dichotomies and debates over the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology that have been less than helpful. Okay, so the second piece that I really wanted to talk, the second dimension or way of thinking about the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology, I think relates to collective identity. And the group's ideology helps define the way in which its members and, very importantly, its potential members think about what it means to be an Egyptian, to be a Muslim, a man, and so forth. And there are a number of different ways that we can take the ideological analysis along this dimension. One is a more careful consideration of how the use of language and vocabulary, imagery and metaphor and narrative make particular identities salient over others. Another is the mountain of new research on the layered relationship between individual and collective identities in social movement organizations. All of this follows the longstanding and robust finding that social ties drive motivation and commitment to the Muslim Brotherhood, not the ideologies, plural, of the group. This finding holds true in both the literatures on social movements generally and on the many histories of the Muslim Brotherhood, more specifically, written in Arabic, French, and English, written with different kinds of data sources and so forth. Now, a strength of the Muslim Brotherhood at many different periods of its history has long been its ability to tie other identities to itself. This is partly a function of its organizational structure, partly a function of its recruiting techniques over time, and also partly a function of its ideological development. My own research on the Muslim Brotherhood's origins, research by Zollner, Leah, Willie, and others about more recent periods all show this same feature of the group operating again and again in different periods of its history. What this really is about is success at understanding and adapting to a changing identity landscape in Egypt and other places where the Muslim Brotherhood operates. And this dimension of ideological analysis also suggests some hypotheses about the current state of the Muslim Brotherhood's expansion. As exile communities grow and develop, ideological commitment will no longer so easily map onto identity commitments in different locations and different contexts. Ideological divisions, which have long plagued the Muslim Brotherhood, may thus pose an even more serious problem for group continuity and unity than it has in recent years. And so this is something that I think a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time thinking about even before the repression of 2013. And I think that this is one dimension that helps open up ideas for why this is going to be a major weakness of the organization moving forward. Finally, let me consider ideology and the Muslim Brotherhood's expansion in terms of viewing the ideology as a manner of, excuse me, I'm sorry, I lost my place when I took my drink. In terms of social organization, let me touch briefly on the social service infrastructure of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's well known, it's well studied, and it's rightly understood as a key part of its mobilization and expansion over many decades. Both the breadth and the depth of the group's social welfare provision has made the ideology of the organization practical for millions of Egyptians, greatly increasing its popularity. And it's also served as the primary point of contact with Brotherhood ideology for most people, a kind of proof of the ideological claim from the slogan, Islam is the answer. The point is that ideology is not, for the vast majority of people anywhere in the world, ideology is not abstract, rarefied, intellectual exercise that it is for scholars and ideologues. It is instead instantiated and lived experience in concrete, practical, and subjectively, at least, seemingly non-political ways. The dismantling of the social service infrastructure of the Brotherhood that began in 2013 thus strikes not just at the heart of the Muslim Brotherhood's organizational capacity, it also strikes at the accessibility, salience, and vibrancy of its ideology. And this issue is compounded by its very public inability to lead Egypt between February 11th, 2011 and July 3rd, 2013, particularly the unwillingness or inability of the Morsi regime to fill leadership positions in government with competent and experienced executives and administrators, which the group had done so successfully in their running of schools, hospitals, clinics, athletic clubs, and so forth in previous eras. Looked at from the perspective of this ideological dimension, I think the future strength of the Muslim Brotherhood is thrown into significant doubt. It suggests that a key factor will be its ability to rebuild its social service infrastructure or to root its ideology in an alternative style of social organization. And ultimately, the main sort of point that I wanted to make today was that viewing the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood in terms of its manner of political claims making and relationship to collective identity and modes of social organization demonstrates both the analytic power of social movement theory and, in my view, empirically, it demonstrates the limits of ideology as an explanatory variable in the study of the organization's expansion. With that, I'm going to conclude and turn over the 2.5 full minutes of my time to Chris and the other panelists for their questions and contributions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it's really interesting to hear about how the ideology failed in Egypt. And it's interesting that it seems that its strength almost became its weakness in terms of losing this ability to provide the very thing that was actually providing concrete support for its ideology slash practical kind of advantages in the lead up to 2013. And I'm not going to try to use that 2.5 minutes you gave me, and in fact let's try to collect them at the end so we can have a few extra minutes for questions. So I'm going to pass it straight on to Dr. Nasser Mohammed Arif. As I said, he's a professor at Cairo University, and I would remind participants, if they don't speak Arabic, to click the interpretation button on their Zoom, which is just to the left of the lead button and to the right of the raise hand button, and they can then listen in English to the trends interpreter. So Dr. Nasser, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for everybody. I'm delighted and honored to be with you today. The organizers asked me to speak in Arabic. I think we need to have the bilingualism existed and presented in this forum. And thank you for the Trends and for the Trends leadership for taking the initiative to start deep and academic and scholarly discussion on this subject matter of the Muslim Brotherhood. because most of the people think that it is coming to an end. I think it is not. Let me switch into Arabic. Okay. شكرا لمركز ترندز للبحوث والاستشارات على هذه الدعوة الكريمة، وسوف أركز حديثي عن التصور حول مستقبل الإخوان. الحقيقة معظم الذين يكتبون حول مستقبل الإخوان يتحركون بطريقة wishful thinking، يعني بمعنى أنهم يكتبون ما يتمنون أن يحدث وليس ما هو متحقق في الواقع. مستقبل الإخوان ليس كما يظن الكثيرون أنه قادم إلى درجة من التحلل والانهيار، لأنها في الحقيقة هي جماعة وظيفية منذ أن نشأت، functional group تخدم من تحقق مصالحه ويساعدها ويتبناها ويقف خلفها. وسوف أركز حديثي حول نقطتين أساسيتين حتى لا نخرج كثيرا ونستطرد في موضوعات وكلها جذابة ومهمة. النقطة الأولى هو مستقبل الإخوان من حيث وجود الجماعة. وهنا تاريخ الإسلام يذكرنا أنه لم تنشأ جماعة في التاريخ المسلمين وانتهت نهاية سريعة أو انتهت أصلا، لابد أن يظل لها بقايا. فالأفكار لا تموت، الأفكار تظل حية، ولكن قد تكون موجودة ولكنها ليست حاضرة أو ليست مؤثرة، وإنها موجودة فقط هنا أو هناك كوجود جامد دون أن يكون لها تأثير فعلي في الواقع. فنحن سنتكلم عن الوجود. وجود جماعة الإخوان في المجتمعات عامة في الشرق وفي الغرب يتوقف على 3 عوامل أساسية. العامل الأول هو سوسيولوجيا الجماعة، بمعنى علم اجتماع الجماعة الداخلي، وهذه موضوعات لم تنل من الدراسة. حدث في السنوات الماضية أنني انشغلت كثيرا وحاولت أن أتعمق بطريق الهواية. عندما أمل من السياسة ندخل في أشياء أخرى، أدب أو شعر، ولكن هذه المرة تعمقت في البلوك تشين. فوجدت أن جماعة الإخوان هي أقرب ما تكون إلى بلوك تشين حقيقي، أكثر تماسكا وقوة من أي منظومة أخرى في البيتكوينز ولا كريبتو كرنسيز ولا واتيفر. يعني الجماعة داخليا لديها شبكة كتل، هي عبارة عن كتلة معلوماتية، كتلة اجتماعية مغلقة. علاقات النسب والمصاهرة والزواج من داخل الجماعة أو بأمر الجماعة وبإذن الجماعة، والعمل والصداقة والانتماء لأي كيان اجتماعي موجود، والدائرة المهنية في النقابة أو في نادي أو في أي تجمع مهني، جميعها محكومة بالانتماء للجماعة. وفي يوم من الأيام كنت أتناقش مع رئيس المعهد العالمي للفكر الإسلامي في واشنطن سنة 99، واحتد النقاش إلى درجة عالية، وقلت له وقتها: لماذا لا تترك هذه المنظومات التي ترى أنها ليست كما ينبغي أن تكون وليست طبقا لقيم الإسلام؟ قال بالحرف: نحن نموت معا ونعيش معا، مهما حدث وأردت أن تخرج يكون صعب جدا. لذلك الذين خرجوا من جماعة الإخوان هم الذين لم يكونوا داخلها بعمق، كانوا على هامشها. لذلك فكرة الكتلة الاجتماعية الثقافية السياسية المغلقة أو السوشيال بلوك تشين هذه ستحافظ على وجود الجماعة، حتى لو على سكيل أصغر، على نطاق أصغر، لكن ستحفظ وجودها في أي منطقة تكون فيها، لأن الخروج منها سيؤدي إلى تفكك أسر وانتهاء وظائف وتخريب أعمال وفقدان مكانة اجتماعية وفقدان دور ثقافي وفقدان وفقدان وفقدان. القضية الثانية في المبرر الذي سيؤدي إلى أن هذه الجماعة ستظل موجودة هو القدرة على التكيف والاستيعاب والتلون، لأنها جماعة عندها قدرة عالية على أن تتكيف طبقا للجو المحيط. في مصر في ثلاثينيات القرن الماضي كانت هي أقرب للصوفية، لأنه المناخ العام كان مناخ صوفي. وعندما بدأت السلفية تغزو مصر على يد محب الدين الخطيب الذي صنع شعار الإخوان واختار اسم الإخوان، وكان مبعوثا من الملك عبد العزيز لتشكيل عقل حسن البنا، وأنشأ المطبعة السلفية في مصر. أخذت الجماعة في أواخر عهدها الاقتراب من النزعة السلفية الوهابية، ثم عندما تصادمت مع عبد الناصر وهاجر قياداتها إلى السعودية تحولت إلى خليط هيتروجينيك مش حقيقي ما بين السلفية والإخوان، وسميت أحيانا السرورية أحيانا الصحوة. كلها كانت عبارة عن خليط إيديولوجي ما بين، كما أشار بروفيسور بياتريك، أنها إيديولوجية تتشكل طبقا للسياق والمحيط لتؤدي الوظائف التي أشار إليها. الإخوان تعتمد في تكوينها على المرحلة الثانية من تدين المسلم الذي يتعمق في تكوين الجماعة وانتماء أعضائها، يجد أنها لا تأتي بشخص من بيئة عدم التدين إلى التدين، هذا لم يحدث. هي تأتي بشخص متدين وتلونه سياسيا أو تسيسه. ومصدر الإمداد للجماعة 3 جماعات: الصوفية والدعوة والتبليغ والسلفية. ال3 مجموعات هذه هي البيئة أو المادة الخام، المناجم التي تأتي بها جماعة الإخوان أو تأتي جماعة الإخوان بعناصرها منها، فهي دائما تتلون حيثما تكون حتى تستطيع استقطاب العناصر. الثالثة هي الاستقلال الاقتصادي، وهذه ال3 عناصر في توقع أن نهاية الوجود لن تحدث قريبا. والاستقلال الاقتصادي، جماعة الإخوان من أهم مزاياها أنها توفر تأمين أو أمن اقتصادي للمنتسبين لها. إذا ما احتاجوا وظائف هناك وظائف، إذا ما احتاجوا دخل السجون هناك من يعول أسرهم، إذا ما احتاجوا علاج هناك من يقوم بهذا الدور. فهناك حماية لأعضاء الإخوان أكثر مما تقوم به الشيوعية أو دولة الرفاهية مثلا في الدول الاسكندنافية على سبيل المثال. وهذا هو الذي يضمن انتماء الأفراد للجماعة واستمرارهم بصورة دائمة للجماعة. وهنا يأتي السؤال: من أين يأتي الاستقلال الاقتصادي؟ لمدى 50 عام أو ما يقارب 50 عام منذ الصدام مع جمال عبد الناصر كانت دول الخليج هي المنجم الاقتصادي للإخوان المسلمين، الذي شكل القاعدة الاقتصادية الضخمة لهم في جميع الدول التي وجدوا فيها، وفي الغرب خصوصا أمريكا وبريطانيا. كله كان يأتي من مؤسسات خيرية، من أفراد. يكفي أن نعرف أنه 2016 أعلن أسامة حمدان ممثل الإخوان في مؤسسة حماس في لبنان لأحد كبار مثقفي لبنان أنه جاءهم في عام 2016 2 مليار دولار تبرعات في شهر رمضان فقط من دول الخليج، تبرعات أفراد. هذا المنجم الاقتصادي تناقص، تراجع، تقلص كثيرا بعد 11 سبتمبر 2001، لكنه لم ينقطع، ما زال موجود، وزال موجود على مستوى الأفراد والتبرعات الشخصية والتمويل الشخصي والعضوية. الجماعة من حيث الوجود من السهل أن تحول دورها إلى دور سياسي. ويكفي أن نتذكر أنه عندما خرج الإخوان من السجون في بداية عصر السادات في 1072 لم يكن هناك في الجماعة أكثر من 49 شخص، ثم قام عبد الفتوح بتجنيد من الجامعات إلى أن وصل العدد كما عرفت من مصدره من الشاطر نفسه في 2011 إلى 700 ألف عضو في مصر. هذا أعلى رقم وصلوه من الأعضاء المنظمين الذين يدفعون تبرعا. النقطة الثانية التي سأتحدث فيها، وهو إذا قلنا أن هذه العناصر الثلاث، السوسيولوجيا، الإخوان، والتكيف والاستقلال الاقتصادي، يحافظوا على وجود الجماعة، فما الذي يحول الجماعة من الوجود إلى الدور السياسي الفعال في أي دولة من الدول؟ هناك عنصر واحد، في رأيي قد أكون خطأ، لكن هناك عنصر واحد الذي يحول الجماعة من مجرد الوجود إلى لعب دور سياسي. هذا العنصر هو قرار الدول، لأن الإخوان قرار دولة، ليست كما يدرسها الذين تعودوا على توظيف مناهج علم الاجتماع ونظرياته وعلم السياسة في دراسة الإخوان كحركة اجتماعية أو سياسية أو حزب سياسي أو حركة تصحيحية أو حركة تنوير أو حركة تغيير أو إلى آخره. هو قرار دولة. فوجود الإخوان وعدم وجوده هو قرار الدولة التي يوجد فيها الإخوان. الدول هي التي تقرر أن يكونوا موجودين أو لا يكونوا موجودين بناء على تحقيق أهدافها، لأنه كما قلت هم جماعة وظيفية تحقق أهداف من يمولهم أو يحركهم أو يسمح لهم بالوجود أو يتسامح مع وجودهم ويقبل به حتى إن لم يتعاون معهم. وننظر نظرات سريعة. وجود الإخوان في مصر في ثلاثينيات القرن الماضي بعد الإنشاء كان قرار الملك، لأنه ملك أحمد فؤاد، لأنه كان يسعى لإعلان الخلافة في مصر بعد نهاية الخلافة في إسطنبول، وكان أحد الداعمين له هم حركة الإخوان، وهم استغلوا هذا وأنشأوا الصحف والمجلات. وانتقل حسن البنا 33 في عز هذه الفورة، انتقل من الإسماعيلية إلى القاهرة. عندما قرر السادات استخدام الإخوان ضد القوميين والناصريين والاشتراكيين والماركسيين بإيعاز وإلحاح واتصال مباشر مع الملك فيصل، الذي أرسل له رئيس المخابرات السعودية كمال أدهم ليقنعه، وفعلا أقنعه وسمح بخروج الإخوان من السجون حتى يخلصوه من أنصار جماعة عبد الناصر. فكان وجودهم قرار دولة. عندما أراد مبارك في مصر أن يوظفهم للتخلص من المعارضة سواء اليسارية أو الليبرالية أو إلى آخره، سمح بوجودهم وسمح لهم بدخول مجلس الشعب، مرة تحت مظلة حزب الأحرار ومرة الوفد ومرة تحت مظلة حزب العمل. هكذا وظفهم ملك الأردن قرار دولة في 96 وتخلص من أعدائه الملك حسين. وهكذا وظفهم الملك محمد السادس في المغرب عندما قرر التخلص من آثار الربيع العربي، فغير الدستور وسمح لهم وشجع الدولة العميقة أو يسمونه المخزن إلى السماح لهم بالتغلغل، وتغلغلوا وحكموا حتى سقطوا سقوطا شعبيا قويا. بريطانيا بالأساس هي قرار دولة، هي من شكلت الإخوان وهي من تستخدمهم إلى تاريخ اليوم. أمريكا فعلت نفس الشيء. ديفيد كابلن في دراسته Hearts, Minds and Dollars The American Pattern Changing the Very Islam اللي نشرت في US News and World Report في 25 ديسمبر 2005، يقول فيها أننا نتبنى الآن استراتيجية هنري كيسنجر التي أسقط بها الشيوعية، وهو أن نوظف المسلم الجيد للتخلص من المسلم الرديء. فعلينا أن نوظف الإخوان للتخلص من كل الاتجاهات العنيفة والمتطرفة عند المسلمين، لأن الإخوان يتقاطعون معه في ثلاثة أشياء: في الإيمان بالديمقراطية وحقوق الإنسان وتمكين المرأة. هذا موجود بالحرف في مقالتي. وما حدث أخيرا الآن في تركيا هم قرار دولة، المغرب، تونس، السودان، الجميع كان قرار دولة، والذي أسقطهم في السودان هو الجيش وليس المظاهرات. وقرار سنة كانت دولة بالمعنى المؤسسي أو دولة عميقة. إذا أردنا في التخطيط في المستقبل للتخلص من هذه أو للتقليل الآثار السلبية لهذه الجماعة، علينا أن نتحرك على دوائر الوجود وعلى دوائر الدور السياسي، وأهم دور فيها هو إقناع الدول أن تتخلص من الإخوان كأداة سياسية. انتهت الدقائق 15 وشكرا جزيلا.
Thank you, Dr. Nasser, for that talk. It's interesting that again the same themes are coming up. That a lot of the support base is based on concrete actions that the Brotherhood takes in order to kind of manufacture group solidarity and provision of services, for example. And we see this in Hezbollah as well. Their support bases, of course, they are providing social services, and there is a concrete benefit from associating with these groups. And we can discuss these state decisions later on. I think it's an important kind of avenue of exploration in terms of how to address these things. But before that, we're going to move on to Dr. Lorenzo Vidino. He's from George Washington University. And as I said, he'll be discussing the Brotherhood's expansion project and its opposition to the nation state. So please take it away, Dr. Vidino.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dr. Mohammed and the entire team at Trends. And I think what Sharifa was saying earlier about Trends having become a reference for people both in the Arab world and in the West when it comes to conversations on Islamism, on the Brotherhood is spot on. It's very correct. And I think we're seeing more and more conversations and products coming from Trends are very useful to have a good debate on the topics we are discussing today, for example. So I'm asked to look at the two concepts of expansion and decline and sort of look at where the Brotherhood is. My expertise is mostly on the Brotherhood in the West, Europe and North America. So I would look mostly at that, but I'm very mindful of what the two previous speakers have been discussing. And I think both of them provided a very good framework to understand the Brotherhood. I do take very much what Dr. Nasser said at heart in terms of the resilience of the Brotherhood in the Arab world. I don't think I've ever heard the analogy to blockchain when it comes to the Brotherhood, but I think it's very smart, and I think it's something that we should look at. Now, obviously, the commentary has been pointing at a very declining Brotherhood in the Arab world. I think all the signs, superficially at least, are there. There's not a single country in the Arab world in which the Brotherhood is doing okay politically, from electoral losses in Morocco to developments that we all know in Egypt and Tunisia. It's probably at its lowest point of its century-old history. And I think what accompanies that very low political point is also two other elements, which I think are very important. One is the loss of state support. It was hinted at before. We no longer see Gulf countries supporting the Brotherhood, at least not in the way that it was done in the decades preceding the Arab Spring. Of course, there are exceptions, but generally speaking, that financial loss is, and political, but also mostly financial loss is important. And second, we're seeing a very widespread loss of popularity within population in the Arab world. So it's not just regimes that are cracking down on the Brotherhood, it's mostly people having experienced ineffectiveness of the rule of the Brotherhood in the years of the peak, as you called it, Chris, 2012, 13, 14, the people have kind of felt disenchanted with the Brotherhood. So this is sort of a unique moment, but the Brotherhood is a blockchain. It's very resilient, has this ability to withstand problems, and has also a very keen political opportunism inherent in its DNA. So there's always the possibility of a comeback, of exploiting certain political dynamics. But I do have to say that the trajectory, I think, in the Arab world points in one direction. Now, what about the West? Where does the West stand? How is the Brotherhood doing in Europe in particular? And I think that's a more complicated question because, of course, a lot of the dynamics of the Arab world don't necessarily apply to Europe. Very different setting, very different Brotherhood with different goals and priority in European countries compared to Muslim majority countries. And I think if I were to answer is the Brotherhood doing okay or doing bad, are they in expansion or in decline? I think it's both. I see things that are going in a good way for them and things that are going in a bad way for them in Europe. So let's start with what is in a way positive for the Brotherhood, in Europe. And there's two main elements, I would say. The first one is basically doing what they have been doing in the West for the last 50 or 60 years, which is using Europe as a sanctuary, a base from which regroup and then operate in the Arab world. This is, again, the very dynamic that created the Brotherhood in the first place in Europe in the 1950s and 60s. But we see it more and more over the last 10 years, and even more if we just look at the Egyptian branch of the Brotherhood, with people leaving Turkey now and settling in London or in other European countries. And Europe does constitute that very convenient base of operation because of its freedoms, because of its laws, because of the, generally speaking, laissez-faire approach of European governments. So that's one positive. I would say the second and even larger positive for the Brotherhood in Europe, it's the coming of age of a second generation of activists who are European-born and are extremely well-versed in the European, the Western political discourse. And thanks to that, are able to do what the first generation of pioneers aspire to do, but were not really capable of doing, which is really becoming mainstream and being able to become sort of legitimate mainstream voices accepted by European establishments. And we're talking again about, in some cases, very young individuals, which are at times somewhat difficult to pinpoint as Brotherhood, or at least it's relatively easy to do, but it's easy for them to defend themselves. They don't look like Brotherhood. They got their political start in Brotherhood milieus, but from their language to the political alliances they keep, they're not exactly your typical Brotherhood modus operandi. These are individuals who have adopted the language of post-colonial theory, very progressive politics. People have started to call them woke Islamism, very much using the concepts of racism, of bigotry, that are very mainstream in the political discourse in Europe, and sort of camouflaging their true nature, which of course comes from their Brotherhood milieu, in a language that makes them much more acceptable, much more palatable to a mainstream establishment. And so we see these activists working very closely with LGBTQ organizations, for example, working very closely with very progressive movements in which in reality they have very little in common if you dig just a little in terms of their ideology, but these are very tactical alliances of these groups, thanks to their ability to understand what is the political discourse that makes European establishment tick, allows them to sort of have this mainstream approach. And we see also the ability in some countries in Europe, not in all of them, to enter political parties, mainstream political parties, mostly on the left, but not only, and be elected, whether at the local, regional, or in some cases at the state, the national level. So this new generation, I think it's one of the best assets that the Brotherhood has in Europe. The flip side to that, the negative, the bad news for the Brotherhood, and I think the bad news comes in a handful of European countries where over the last 2 or 3 years, let's say in a couple of countries, probably a bit longer than that, we have seen governments and a good part of the mainstream political establishment and media really waking up to what is the Brotherhood and what is the challenge, the negative impact that the Brotherhood has on European societies. And this is something very new. It's not that nobody in Europe that understood that before. There were always voices within the European political discourse that understood that the Brotherhood was a problem. But this conversation has gotten significantly more mainstream. It transcends the traditional left or right divide. Being anti-Islamist or being at least concerned about the impact of the Brotherhood in Europe was traditionally a domain of the right, or at least the center-right. That is no longer the case in many European countries. In France, it's actually mostly the left that drives sort of the concerns about the Brotherhood. So I don't want to be, again, Dr. Nasser was very smart in saying that wishful thinking at times may cloud our judgment on events that relate to the Brotherhood. We are seeing the beginning of a certain very different conversation and approach when it comes to the Brotherhood. In certain countries, I would say France and Austria in particular, that is very advanced, but I think Netherlands, Denmark, and in terms of political debate, also in Germany, the UK, that conversation is much more mainstream than 5-10 years ago. Ups and downs, problems, it's not perfect, but I would say the progress is quite quite evident, and that has created a problem for the Brotherhood. I would say, to be schematic, and I'm just mindful of time, it manifests itself in three very practical ways. First of all, it's just the level of discourse and understanding on the Brotherhood, with very mainstream politicians and entities making very clear the point that the Brotherhood is a problem, and articulating that analysis in very open terms, saying that, and this is the argument that, for example, President Macron in France has articulated several times, arguing that the Brotherhood and what some call non-violent Islamism in general provides as a challenge is twofold. One is the fact that while not directly violent, it provides a narrative that is conducive to violence. It creates a fertile environment for more radical groups. In France, the moment that led to that awareness in a very mainstream was the assassination of the French teacher Samuel Paty, who was killed by somebody who had jihadist sympathy, but who got the message that Paty needed to be killed because of his alleged blasphemy from things he read online in Brotherhood-aligned milieus. So you really had that in very practical terms, the proof that violence stems, in some cases, of course, stems from a certain narrative that comes from allegedly non-violent milieus. But then there is the separatism, communitarism discourse that Macron has been articulating, which is to say, even if non-violent, the Brotherhood narrative provides a message that tears apart European society. This provides a narrative of us and them, if not us versus them, that creates a huge divide into European societies. And I think this conversation has become mainstream. I mentioned Macron, but I can speak of several other very prominent politicians, again, on the right, the center, and the left of the political spectrum that articulate this. So this is a massive change that influences then more practical measures, which is the second level I'm looking at, which is some of the action, very tangible actions that have been taken in some European countries. The French have started shutting down organizations that belong to the Brotherhood milieu. And that is very much because they provide a narrative that is contrary to the values of the French Republic, or that is inciting violence. So they're not necessarily directly engaged in terrorism, but the bar is now set lower. It's no longer enough not to be engaged in terrorism if you provide a message that is significantly at odds with French value. The French state takes action. And these are measures that have been very criticized. There's a big debate on that with some of the closures of some of the entities that the French government has operated. The Council of State, the Conseil d'État in France has approved these closures. The decisions have been appealed, and the judicial, the process, the administrative process has been approved. In Austria, there's a massive trial. There's a massive police operation which led basically to the investigation into pretty much everybody that Austrian authorities consider to be on the sort of leadership spectrum of the Brotherhood in Austria, with massive searches and raids that took place exactly a year ago, November of last year, and there'll likely be a trial in the future. So these are actions that are unprecedented, quite aggressive. And I think a lot of other European countries are looking at what France and Austria are doing. The final tangible thing that we see is, and this is where a lot of European countries are coming together on, because it's sort of the lower threshold, is the financial aspect of things. Again, we all know that one of the main reasons why a relatively small elite group like the Brotherhood has been able to have this disproportionate influence in Europe, it's because of its access to resources, its ability to have massive funds that come from different sources, some historically from the Gulf, some through their own business endeavors, and so on. This is to some degree changing. Different countries have started implementing laws making it illegal, or at least making it more difficult for them to receive funds from abroad, or making the process more transparent. In several cases, these organizations received funding from individual countries or from the European Union. This is also changing. If you saw, for example, what the French government did over the last couple of weeks, in which it put significant pressure on the European Council and on the European Union for funding Brotherhood-linked entities, this tells you a bit about the change of mood that is taking place in Europe. Even in a country like Sweden, which traditionally has always been very Brotherhood friendly, if you allow me, this is somewhat changing. Decision in an administrative court in Sweden recently stated that a Brotherhood-linked organization could no longer receive funds from the Swedish state because it did not meet the democracy clause, meaning that the speakers that it brings on, the literature that it disseminates, clearly advocates against democracy, and so they should not be receiving funds from the state. It's a very low bar, if you will, but for decades that wasn't happening. So it's one part of the potential decline. So you have to put all these things together. I think the Brotherhood stands has managed to create these connections to European establishments. I don't find it extremely successful in most cases with Muslim communities. I think they have, of course, a little pocket of supporters and sympathizers, but if you see, for example, their ability to mobilize people for their causes, it's very tiny. What is the standard to judge popularity is very difficult. But if you see, for example, the Rabat anniversary events that they organize in most European countries, there's generally a couple of hundred people showing up. And that tells you their inability to mobilize the Muslim population in Europe, if not for certain causes like Islamophobia or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But for specific Brotherhood causes, they show that they don't have much traction. They do have traction with European establishments, and I think really the battle is within European establishments on how they're going to see the Brotherhood, whether they're going to open their eyes and see it for the way Macron sees it, the way the Austrian government sees it, or remain where most Europeans were 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's where we're going to see the expansion or decline of the Brotherhood, because how European countries will deal with it, fully understanding that even if they see it in negative terms, there are limits to what European states can do. In a democratic society, they can crack down only to some degree. And of course, the Brotherhood, as always, is very effective Islamophobia defense card, in which they tarnish anybody that accuses them or anything of being bigots and racists and Islamophobes. And that's a powerful weapon in a European political discourse. But really, the battle is fought within European establishments on how we're going to see the Brotherhood, and that will affect whether the Brotherhood in Europe will be in expansion or decline. I can leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to move straight on, and then we'll have a discussion afterwards to Dr. Patrice Brodeur. Probably butchered the pronunciation of your name. I apologize. And he's going to be discussing the prospects for the expansion strategy after the events in Egypt on June 30th, 2013. So please take it away, Dr. Brodeur.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Al-Ali and Heikel and all of the team at Trends, especially Ms. Sumaya and also Sharifa here present with us for organizing this. I cannot emphasize how important creating these spaces for discussing academically sort of the future of the Muslim Brotherhood, the current, past, and future of the Muslim Brotherhood as the epitome of the center of the development of Islamism in the contemporary 20th century and 21st century is. And so I'd like to just begin by saying that coming last, of course, one has the problem of, in a way, repeating what has already been said. And in a way, I agree so much with much of what was said earlier, especially with Dr. Vidino's presentation and elements that literally dovetails with the examples I was going to give about France and Austria and all of that, so that I'll just scrap and probably reduce the time of my presentation in order to avoid repetition. But I do agree that taking a social theory movement approach, as Dr. Monson has suggested, is incredibly important to be able to not treat the Muslim Brotherhood or any other form of Islamist discourses and organizations to be exceptional, but rather to be comparable, of course, from a scientific perspective with other organizations. So that goes for me without saying. But also, I think that the point about the blockchain that Dr. Arif mentioned, I think is extremely important, because I do believe also that it's relatively easy, although time consuming, of course, to collect all the facts, the empirical evidence for the decline of the Muslim Brotherhood officially in so many areas, both in Arabo-Muslim countries as well as in the West and other places as well around the planet. But what is much, much more difficult to assess, of course, is the ways by which sort of the resilience and the transformation is taking place, and in ways that are not yet maybe perceivable to us who study this phenomena. So that, I think, bodes well for the future of scholarship in a way, by meaning that we have to be able to monitor things and see where they go from here on, as the surface seems to be indeed showing a decline officially from the state, as well as the popular support, as were mentioned already by previous speakers, but also I think in the sense that the viability of the discourse itself starts to be frailed in comparison to other ways in which Muslim understanding of the ways in which a rooted identity in Islam and the way it can function very well with different notions of modernity is increasing in terms of its both written and oral transmission to a wider and younger generation across the world. So that, I think, is very important, and that in turn is supported by a larger and increasing number of states, whether in the Gulf, as we've mentioned already, in most cases, as well as in all the way up to Indonesia, with, of course, a very important impact given sort of its numbers being the largest Muslim country in the world. But let me just say that the possible sort of addition I can make to the conversation here today has to do with the work that I've been doing with my colleague, Dr. Wael Saleh, who is at Trends at the moment. And we're going to be republishing an update of our 2017 book it'll come out in early next year on political Islam in a post-Arab Spring. And that book has a few chapters, but one of them actually looks at the nomenclature that we're trying to develop in order to make sense of these developments. And that's directly relates to the topic of today. Because I'd like to talk about the ways in which we can frame sort of both the decline and the continuity in the future of the Muslim Brotherhood, as well as, broadly speaking, the phenomena of Islamism, by actually thinking about three concepts. One which is one which is retro-Islamism, another one which is neo-Islamism, and a third one which is necro-Islamism. And so part of what I'll do is to define those terms and to sort of flesh them out a little bit in terms of examples, and see sort of how, whether or not that is viable for the academic community, as it hopefully sort of can use this terminology to make sense of the complexity that is unfolding before our eyes in that particular movement and Islamism in general. So let me begin by saying that we sort of anchor our work first and foremost in a definition of Islamism that we take from Lamshishi all the way back, or more than 20 years now, who sort of defined Islamism in terms of a shift from spiritual, and I quote here, a shift from spiritual and religious order to that of political protest. It exploits this disarray, i.e. authoritarian state, corruption, etc., by diverting for its own benefit the values of justice and equality to which the popular imagination remains very attached. Islam is thus used for political ends. Islamism also diverts identity and cultural malaise for its own benefit in order to present itself as an alternative to the crisis of values. This crisis has resulted in the transformation of Islamic identity into a religious ideology functioning primarily as a strategy of legitimation, or conversely, of political delegitimization. unquote. And so that frames sort of, that's one way of framing Islamism in general. And it definitely is important because you could see the influence of political science sort of in the wording and the way of defining this particular sort of concept of Islamism. And what's also important is that while we have this terminology that has emerged in French initially and then in English, it is a problem for me as a scholar of religion in general, and not only as a scholar of Islam. It is a problem that we don't have for other religious traditions that have also developed their own wings of extremists, of political Christianity or political Judaism and so on and so forth, political Hinduism, for example. We have not developed a terminology that is distinct from the word of the religion itself, in the way that we have Islam and then we have Islamism. So already there's a particular exceptional case in the study of Islamism that I find at times problematic when it comes to doing comparative religion and political science applied to political ideology and its links to religions. So that's already sort of just a point, a passing point that I want to make, but that troubles me a little bit, and I don't quite know what to do about it. But let's again get back to this concept that therefore, when we think about the impact of the Arab Spring, we often think that with the Arab Spring sort of emerged sort of more clearly trends which already, Olivier Roy and Asef Bayat had targeted and described as being post-Islamism. And according to Asef Bayat, post-Islamism is a multi-dimensional movement. It is part of a conscious attempt to transcend Islam in the social, political, and intellectual realm to achieve an alternative modernity, uniting Islam with individual free choice, freedom of democracy, and a new generation of intellectuals. So renouncing the dominant, totalizing, exclusivist logic of Islamism, post-Islamism in its intellectual form recognizes pluralism and compromise. For Olivier Roy, since the 1990s already, the Muslim world has entered what he calls also a post-Islamist era, defined as, quote, the appearance of a space of secularism in Muslim societies, the religious field tending to become more secular, and that dissociated from the political field per se, unquote. Practices and thus individualized and or privatized notions in community spaces have emerged, and the roles of believers and citizens are dissociated. The insertion of the recent history of Islamism in the features of liberalism and secularism underlies an almost involuntary convergence unthought of as such by the actors between Islam and modernity. This convergence, according to Olivier Roy's analysis, is essentially formulated at the political level. Quote, the characteristic of post-Islamism is that it is the religious who himself defines a space of secularism, not positively, but because that the field of religion is reduced by its incapacity to subsume the political and to define a positive right, unquote. So, having said that, in contradistinction to that sort of notion of post-Islamism, which I think needs to be nuanced precisely in the opposite paradoxical dimensions of that we talked already about in terms of the Muslim Brotherhood as an example of both declining and expanding or transforming in different ways which are not fully yet understood. Let us now define more precisely these three terms that I mentioned, which we want to integrate into the debate on the current state as well as the future of political Islam. First, the concept of retro-Islamism. It is an Islamism turned towards the discourse of the past, towards the initial discourse, frozen on a totalizing and exclusivist logic, denying pluralism, uncertainty, compromise, and therefore making the nation state its enemy and not considering any democracy that is procedural as such, except of course if one can use it for gaining political power. And so that form of retro-Islamism looks very much on the surface as in fact a continuation of regular Islamism. And therefore that sort of is something which we need to take into account, which goes in and of itself against the thesis of post-Islamism as defined by Asaf and Roy. So that's on the one hand. Then the second term is neo-Islamism. of course, going in a completely opposite direction. And that term, of course, I think is more reflective of what some call sort of the decline of Islamism and of the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. And so in contrast, neo-Islamism is an outgrowth, yes, indeed, from Islamism, but which takes a different form after the Arab Spring and its aftermath, namely an Islamism, in fact, paradoxically, without political Islam. What does that mean? Bluntly, is that neo-Islamism we see as a process of de-Islamizing Islamism by emptying it of almost all of its initial foundations, but keeping only to the name of the organization, the movement, and some of its sort of, generic sort of discursive tropes. This neo-Islamism renounces almost all of the reasons for Islamism in the first place, and almost all of its founding principles, in addition to letting go of all of its weapons that were used to mobilize and recruit. And in that sense, those organizations that are moving more in this direction are, I think, sort of in the case of the Muslim Brotherhood, as was described earlier, an example that seems to be falling, at least on the surface, towards this neo-Islamism. So in short, and in the medium term, we believe that Islamists, more particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, are doomed either to going in direction of retro-Islamism or neo-Islamism. And in fact, it's probably sort of a conjunction of both of those. And that's part of the challenge, I think, in trying to make sense of what's happening today, and also how that links to the multi-layered sort of identities and dynamics that was mentioned already in previous presentations. And sort of in contrast to the medium and to the short and medium future, I'd like to argue that in the long term, that is, if we can be so bold to even think about the long term in this area, the prospect seems to be that whether the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist organizations move towards, one direction of retro-Islamism or the opposite direction of neo-Islamism, that in a way, in both cases, the future seems to be more like one of-necro-Islamism. And necro-Islamism means basically the disappearance of Islamism in the sense that the terminology may be used, the name continues, but the actual content is emptied completely at the end of what was originally linked to an Islamist ideology. And so, and in that sense, it's a prelude to the death of a particular form of Islamism. So there we go with the three particular kinds of definitions that we have. I'd just like to look at the time, because my second part had to do with giving examples to all of this. And because I'm already approaching my 15 minutes, I think the best is, because I'm literally was using many of the examples that Dr. Virino used. So I'm going to stop here to allow us, in fact, more time to exchange and dialogue with each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bradur. Yeah, thanks for leaving us some time. I mean, personally, I was looking forward to hearing the examples. But I think perhaps a good place to start I suppose it's kind of a broad question that perhaps anyone can respond to. But what I'm hearing is that it's quite difficult in many ways to kind of confront Islamism as an ideology. But obviously I'm British and I look at Islamist movements across Europe, generally speaking. And I think one of the problems that we're seeing, and a few of the speakers today have alluded to it, is this kind of conflation of Islamism with Islam as a religion. How can countries confront Islamism, the movement, without alienating their Muslim populations, especially as Dr. Munson said, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist movements are good at ensuring that their personal identity as a Muslim, for example, is politicized. And so how can we prevent these people from feeling attacked while also ensuring that these movements that are counter to democracy and other Western values are maintained? I think I'll hand it over to Dr. Munson, but if anyone else wants to respond afterwards, then I think that's a good place to start.
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's a great question. I mean, it is the question of the moment. I don't think I differ from anyone else in clearly not having a great answer, right? I mean, if this was easy, it would be already done. I guess I would only say that my own view is the way to do this is to think about how, for the vast majority of people, ideology is a thing that is instantiated in practice and in their everyday lives. And so the key is to sort of break that connection between sort of toxic forms of ideology that exist and the sort of practical day-to-day activities that people are engaged in and their engagement in organizations. And I mean, this is a great example of a place where I can point to, like, I don't think we need to have Muslim Brotherhood experts only in a question like that, right? I mean, Western governments are facing this across the political spectrum with the rise of populism writ large, so often connected to religious radicalism, but not necessarily connected to religious radicalism. So this is a much bigger question, I think, that you ask. And I don't think the answer necessarily has to be specific to the Brotherhood.
If I might add something, Chris? Chris?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, there's no easy answer to this. Of course, it's very complicated, and there's an ability, of course, of the Brotherhood to spin any action that is taken to undermine them and make them as a giant attack against all Muslims or against Islam itself. And I think that has that sort of a paralyzing impact on a lot of Western policymakers. I do think, and I know that from some just personal anecdotes, experience in which seeing that people in the Middle East or within Muslim communities in Europe were the first ones to actually criticize Islamism and the Brotherhood, to make that clear distinction between Islamist and Islam, is something that in a way gave courage to some Western policymakers to speak out. The more they see that their views are supported, their potential criticism of the Brotherhood is supported by people in the region, by people who might be extremely conservative religiously, but not Islamists. I think that is something that is still, and I think sometimes it's a bit embarrassing to see how 20 years after 9/11, there's still a lot of ignorance in a lot of policy making quarters in Europe, but that's still the reality. So it comes as a surprise, in many cases a positive surprise to many European policymakers, that actually the Brotherhood it's preposterous to go in the Middle East and to make the equation that Brotherhood leaders represent Islam. Everybody would be laughed off stage if you were to say something like that in any Arab country, but it is somewhat of an accepted statement de facto in Europe. So if the voice is dismantling that construct that the Brotherhood have been able to create, that perception, I think that's something that is extremely, extremely helpful. Now, of course, there's always the risk on the part of Western countries to have populists genuinely jump on some of these initiatives and framing them in the wrong way. And it's undeniable that some of those tendencies do exist in European societies. So it is up for the political center, for the people who do not belong to these extremes on one side, to frame the conversation in the right way. And yes, I think it's inevitable at times to grow a tough skin and be at times subjected to some accusations of Islamophobia. I think that's par for the course. It's inevitable, some of it.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Arif, I think you might have something to add to this.
Yes, actually, 2009, I faced the same question in a lecture I delivered in Joint Special Forces University in Tampa for 71 Special Forces leader. And they were facing this issue, this problem practically. So my answer was at that time, and I think it is still valid till today, that we need to understand that the ideology of Islam, not the ideology of the Islamism. So Islam is different layers. At least we can here for this, for the sake of clarifying this point, we need to clarify three different layers of Islam, or three different faces of Islam. First one, Islam as religion, which is believed in by around 1,500,000,000 or something, or more. And this is a generic thing. This is the faith, the creed, and the jurisprudence, and the rituals. It is a common thing among all the Muslims, regardless of their level of education or standard of living. The second layer is Islam as an identity. So Islam as an identity, as Dr. Monson discussed it, the issue of identity for Muslims like to live their identity whenever they go. They wanted to eat halal food, most of them, or to dress Islamic dress, or to celebrate festivals, to go to the mosque, regardless of their religiosity, whether every day or every week or every year. But it is part of identity. And this is very common. But for specific cases like countries and they facing a problem of identity, like in, for example, Pakistan or Southeast Asia, they are keen or to define themselves as Muslims. Most of the countries, like in the Middle East, they are not keen to do that. They are keen to define themselves as Arabs or Egyptian or Moroccan or Algerian more than Muslim. But for Pakistani, they would like to say Muslims, because the idea of Islam is a sort of identity in the formation of a state and historical experiences. The third layer is Islam as an ideology, political ideology. So from religion to identity to ideology. The problem we are facing and the whole world is facing was the third level, which is adopted by a few millions, regardless if the name are Ikhwan or ISIS or Qaeda or Tahrir or whatever. Those people are using Islam as a platform or as a tool, as a way or an instrumental way to fulfill their own political dreams or political goals. So we are facing this one. Most of the Western countries, especially when they are facing this ideology, they don't know the distinction between ideology and identity and religion. They sometimes attack or hit or do some or say something wrong against the first two. By doing this, they are empowering the third level. They are empowering those who are adopting the ideology, who are using Islam for political causes or for personal causes. So the misunderstanding of these three levels will lead to negative actions or wrong policies in confronting Islamism or Islamic extremism or terrorism. When Muslim countries are very liberal in allowing media to do some comic against the Prophet, while they cannot say anything about the genocide under the same umbrella of freedom of rights. The Muslims in Pakistan and in India, they take it in the wrong way. They support the extremists there. And those who are spreading the idea of animosity between civilization, they will find the room to flourish and to grow. So as intellectuals, as writers, we need to clarify these distinctions in order to help the policymakers not to go in a wrong way and to be the best recruiters of ISIS or Qaeda or Ikhwan by doing or adopting wrong policy or doing wrong things, which will hit the identity or the religion. Thank you.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, if anyone wants to jump in, please just, yeah, sure. Dr. Radu.
Yes, and I agree with what Dr. Alif just said between those three levels of religion, identity, and ideology. What's really important, though, for governments, let's face it, is to do it in a systematic, comparative way, so that one applies this distinction across the different sort of layers or the different kinds of religion. So this way, there's a sense of equal treatment, which is being done, and that one does not necessarily only single out sort of Islam and Islamism and Muslims, you know, in the process, because that only feeds into a problem of whether you call it, you know, Islamophobia or racism against Muslims. But I think it's really important to understand in making sort of that cross sort of analysis because of Hindu developments with the BJP in India, and also some political discourses around sort of Buddhism in Myanmar and so on and so forth. And so this, I think, you know, is important to be made, as well as, of course, with Judaism and Zionism and so on and so forth. So all of these sort of overlaps need to be clearly sort of, you know, distinguished, so that we don't end up sort of, you know, making generalizations that end up sort of actually going against Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that gives freedom of religion, belief, and conscience to all human beings.
And is there any examples you can think of where governments are getting this right without going too far? I mean, off the top of my head, I'm thinking about France, and I'm thinking about how, of course, they've had these horrific terrorist incidents, but then the next time you hear that they're planning to ban hijabs in government or something like that, or they have these local movements against the burkini on the beach. I mean, and those don't necessarily strike me as effective, perhaps.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, you guys are the experts, but is there examples that you can say that this is progressing in the right way, perhaps from Europe and the Middle East, or the Arab world, or further afield?
Let me you know, speak for Canada and say that we have the best and the worst in a way, you know, relatively speaking, of course. But I would argue that, you know, the current sort of political Liberal Party has an approach which is more constructive in that respect, in trying to be sort of more fair across the board. Although exceptionally and paradoxically, the Quebec province, with the development of its Bill 21, goes very closely in the direction, or moves more and more in the direction of what's happening in France, which is clearly sort of problematic, I think, on a human rights perspective. So I think that these are two opposing kinds of things happening within the same nation state, as one example.
And what exactly is Canada getting right then, in terms of policies?
First of all, it's an approach to secularism, which talks about the ways in which you can, in understanding the notion of multiculturalism as a political ideology, it has implications that requires sort of the state to make sure that it's neutral as much as possible when it comes to the ways in which religious communities self-organize themselves, and as long as they don't dovetail and start sort of meddling into direct sort of political party dynamics, then you know, they have a lot of freedom to basically do what they want to do, as long as, of course, they respect sort of the freedoms that are basics to all Canadian citizens. And so, in that sense, there is, and also the state coming in recently. There were two summits this summer in early August. One addressing anti-Semitism, the next day addressing Islamophobia. And it was very interesting to see, of course, how the political party that was seeking at that time re-election, which it did get to be re-elected, the Liberal Party, ended up sort of using these notions of having summits you know, to decrease and talk about the problem of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, in order to try to get sort of somehow some political mileage among religious people, both the Jewish and the Muslim communities, when it comes to the state's sort of notion of protecting their rights to be free from these kinds of injustices, discursive or otherwise, because we've had a few hate crimes along those lines in Canada as well. And so that's, I think, where the positive comes in. But of course, sometimes it feels like it's done in an instrumentalizing way for the political party to gain votes, as I just mentioned. And that, of course, is not really sort of the appropriate sort of approach I think that should be taken, because it's obviously used, well, it's using sort of fears in society from different communities to try sort of to gain votes. And that's not in the long term the best either.
And perhaps this, yeah, please go ahead.
I think I need to indicate to a study done by an Italian professor in Bologna University. His name is Silvio Ferrari. He was doing a survey among in European countries, and he reached a point that he was looking at the spiritual assistant for Muslims and Jews and other faiths, and tolerance for their symbols like mosques and raising call for a prayer and so on, and education. And he reached a point that countries like Sweden, Spain, France are good in terms of education and religious symbols. In education, and they are not. The other side. They are not the same level of tolerance or be tolerant toward the ritual assistance or symbols. So in Europe, you find some countries are very negative in ritual symbols like Belgium, France, and some of them are very good in terms of education, are the same. France is very good, Belgium and Sweden, Spain. I'm reading from the diagrams here. So it needs to be studied. I think we cannot generalize. Some of them are good on one side or doing very good on one side and the opposite on the other side. So we cannot say there is cases which represent this kind of adopting a policy that have this kind of distinction. Sorry for taking more time. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Luckily, we saved so much earlier. I'm interested to learn more about how it's progressing in the United States as well. Of course, we've discussed Canada, and Europe is, it's constantly being discussed here, of course, and across civil society. But in the United States, of course, I don't live there, but perhaps Dr. Munson, you could explain to us a little bit about where it differs or perhaps aligns with European and perhaps even Arab world issues or attitudes or approaches.
Well, I don't think it differs that much in terms of the sort of overall politics of it from Canada. Canada's in a different place politically, but the debates are still the same. I guess let's say this. 5 years ago, I would have said that there is no political space, there's no oxygen in the United States for policies that explicitly target one specific religious tradition over another. I was proven wrong over the last couple of years, in which the Trumpism sort of tried to bring that to the fore as a way to sort of identify enemies and so forth. But, I don't think that is tied to Islam so much as it's tied to immigration and sort of identifying, outside enemies writ large. Whether they're Muslim or not Muslim is less important in American politics. What I'm struck by, I'm still thinking through the kind of typology that Dr. Arif gave. And, at least in the United States, when it comes to Christian nationalism, which is a term that is increasingly being used to describe a type of political radicalism in the United States tied to Christianity, the findings are quite interesting, which is that, Christian nationalism appeals most to those who are least embedded in civic institutions and particularly in churches, right? And so it's the very process of secularization and the disconnection from civil society that leads people to, in the typology that Dr. Arif gave, to confuse religion as a qua religion with religion qua identity or ideology. And so to the extent, so my own sense is that the policies that work best in this area across faith traditions are ones that support and reinforce civic institutions that embed people in larger communities that give them identities and perspective on their own faith. This makes the sort of radicalized or extremist views, it gives them less oxygen, and it makes people dismiss them in much the way, in much the same way that the point was made earlier that you can't convince people in Arab countries that Muslim Brotherhood leaders represent Islam writ large because they know better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it sounds like perhaps the most effective way of dealing with it, but manufacturing those larger communities is, I would imagine, much easier said than done, and that sense of belonging.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, the issue is short-term versus long-term, right? I mean, the scale of politics is the scale of, parties in power and individual politicians' careers. The institutional basis of civil society is something that's much more long-term, but it requires investment now for payoff later. And I think that's much more effective than the flashier things that you might do sort of in the short term.
Brilliant. Look, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for everyone who made time for a discussion at the end. I think it's been really fruitful. And thank you to all the participants for sharing your views, and to Trends for hosting such a important and timely discussion. I don't believe Sharifa wants to make any closing remarks, so I think I'll leave it there. And thanks to everyone for tuning in to watch today's discussion. I'm sure the recordings will be made available online on the Trends website, and perhaps their YouTube channel as well. Yeah, so thanks to everyone for taking part, and for tuning in wherever you were.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Very
Thank you very
interesting
much.
ideas.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.